In this video, we will talk about changing permissions on files and directories. We've talked about those permissions. What are they? What do they mean? But how do we specify them? We're just going to create a file to work with. I'm going to call it my file. I'm going to create it with touch. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to exist and be something we can play with. So if I do ls-l on my file, we can see the default permissions. I have read and write permission. Everyone else has read permission. What if I want something different? I need to be able to specify the permissions. And the command we use to do that is chmod. It's usually pronounced chmod. What in the world's a chmod? What does chmod mean? Chmod is short for change mode. You may remember when we talked about permissions, we said there's 12 bits of data that specify the permissions. And that 12-bit chunk of data is called the mode of the file. Now we change the mode. We're specifying the permissions. We change the mode. Change mode is a big long word, so they just shortened it to chmod. So the chmod command is what we use to manipulate those bits in the mode. And there are two different kinds of syntax, two different ways to specify what we want to do in the chmod command, two variations. One variation is a little more complex to use or to specify, but it's easier to understand. And the other syntax is much easier to specify, but a little more complex to understand. So first, let's look at the one that is the easier to understand syntax. The argument I want to give to chmod, I specify either user, group, or others, or I can specify any or all of them. I can specify 1, 2, or 3 of those. So the U is me, the user, the owner of the file. And we don't say O because we need the letter O for others. So it's not owner, it's user. The G for the group and O for others. So those three sets of permissions. What do I want to do? I can either add or remove. In my case, I'm going to add. And then what do I want to add? Read, write, or execute. This is saying for user, group, and others, add the right permission. And then finally, I have to say what I want to do it on. We look at my file. Now we see that the right permission has been added for everybody. It was already there on user. No big deal to add it again. How about if I want to remove permissions? Let's say I want to remove all the permissions, the read and write, for the group and others. Take this file private. I don't want anybody else to be able to use it. Take a look. There we go. I've made the permissions go private. It's a very easy to understand syntax. I just specify who I'm doing it for, what I'm doing, adding or removing, and then which permissions I'm adding or removing. But now the other syntax lets us specify the entire permission set all at once. And it's actually the original syntax of the chmod. This syntax we just talked about came a little later. The original syntax was just to specify those 12 bits, specify the information in the permissions, and to do it as an octal number. I don't want to make anybody's head spin too bad, but if we envision each of those sets of permission bits, there's 3 bits. There's the read, the write, and the execute. And if we imagine it's a 1 for set and a 0 for not set, then we have a little 3-digit binary number. That lets us make the digits from 0 through 7. So that's an octal digit. So it becomes very easy with any one of those numbers 0 through 7, we can specify all the various combinations of read, write, and execute. I made a little file here. On the left-hand side, I have made all the various combinations of 1s and 0s. And then in the middle, I have put what those look like if you say a 1 is either read, write, or execute is set, and a 0 is that it's not set and it's a dash. And then finally, what that single digit is that represents it. 0 is nothing set, for example. 5 is a very common one. 5 is read and execute are set. You can see what it looks like in binary. It's 101. Now, in real life, you don't necessarily need to know all of these. 0, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the most commonly used. If you use the chmod command a lot, you're just going to start to learn what those mean. Here's how we use that syntax of the chmod command. I could say chmod 640. I say I want the permissions to be 640. So I want the user permissions to be 6. We can look at our little cheat sheet. That's read and write. We want the group permissions to be read, the 4, and we don't want the other people to have permissions. Let's look just at my file. You can see there's the 6, there's the 4, and there's the 0. And there's a few combinations that pop up fairly commonly. 644, 755, 640, 750. Those are some pretty common combinations that pop up. You kind of get used to again if you use this a lot. So now there's one special permission that we need to talk about, and it's a permission that's not specified in the mode. I can actually say, take away all permissions. Let me do that again, ls-l my file, so we don't confuse things. Okay, let's just put that up there. There are no permissions. Nobody has any permission to do anything with this file. It's just straight dashes all the way across. I set the permissions to 0, 0, 0. What does that even mean? Well, it means anything I want to do with this file, I'm going to get permission denied. It's kind of a meaningless thing, but it lets us set the example. Because there is one permission that, like I said, is not specified in the mode, and that is the permission to set the permissions. The permission to set the permissions always belongs to the owner of the file. Since I am the owner of the file, 640, let's say, my file, I can always set those permissions, even if I don't have permission to do anything with the file, as I did in that case. And that's a permission that cannot be granted to anyone else. It is only for the owner of the file. The other thing that I can change as the owner of the file is what group those permissions apply to. By default, it went with my default group, which is Jeff. But maybe I want to associate this file with another group. There's other people I want to be able to read my file, not the people in group Jeff. So now the only catch is I have to be a member of the group. There's a handy command ID that lists all the groups that I'm a member of. Let's just, for example, use the group CD-ROM. chgrp is change group to CD-ROM of my file. And then if I do an ls-l of my file, the group that's associated with that file now is CD-ROM. Change group is a permission that only the owner of the file has. Now the final command to look at in this video is we had chmod, we had chgrp, and we have chown. Chown changes the owner of a file. And the syntax is you give a name of the user that you want to change the owner to, and then you specify the file. If I try this as myself, I get operation not permitted. Non-root users are not allowed to change the owner of a file. That is a permission that is reserved exclusively for root. Now, why would that be? There's a couple of bad things that could happen if I can change the owner of a file. If there are disk quotas in place, I could hide some files by changing the owner to somebody else. Then I'm allowed to store files and violate the quota because the files would get charged to the other person. That's a somewhat bad thing. The worst thing is I could maybe put files in someone else's path and cause them to execute a command that wasn't the command they were thinking if I'm allowed to change ownership of a file to them. The default is that's not an allowed permission. There's just bad things that could happen if I'm able to give files to someone else. There's no guarantee that I'm going to be trustworthy in that, is what it boils down to. So only root can change the owner of a file. Let's do it with sudo. Sudo chown nobody. Nobody is actually a user on the system. There is a user called nobody. Give my password. Now if I look at my file, now my file is owned by nobody. So nobody is somebody on Linux. Nobody's actually a special user that basically has no special permissions. And I'm just using it for an example here. So there you go. Chown, chmod, and chgrp are the ways we manage the permissions, the ownership, and the group on files and directories as well.